So hey anime fans. The series name is What If Naruto Got Harem with Kurama. So let's start the series. The person in front of her, standing at attention with his hands behind his back and a slight smile on his face, left Retsu Unohana unsure of what to think. He had 3 whisker birth markings on his face, blue eyes that were even brighter than hers, and spiky blonde hair. Tight, compact muscle covered every inch of his physique, which appeared to have been sculpted for nothing but combat, a perfect balance of speed and force. He was wearing the traditional Shinigami robe, with a katana by his side and what appeared to be an orange shirt underneath it, possibly due to the fact that the top of the robe was slightly open. The robe was held together by an orange rope. The most peculiar aspect of the katana, however, was the blood-crimson bandages that were securely fastened around the guard and sheath, making it impossible to draw the blade without first taking them off. Naruto was the newest member of the 4th Division, and he was definitely the last person she would have anticipated to ask to be sent to it. According to the information she had been given about him, he was an average student in nearly every class at the academy, kept to himself most of the time, and had mediocre sword skills. Actually, Healing Kido was the only class in which he had completely failed. She said that he was still unaware of the name of his Zanpakuto. However, Unohana had only ever saw someone wrap their Zanpakuto in the same manner as he had when they were aware of the term but were afraid of what it may do. Right out of the academy, he had been offered a spot in the 11th Division. However, he declined and requested to be assigned to the 4th Division, which prompted the inquiry. Why? Unohana struggled to contain the giggle in the back of her throat as he tilted his head slightly and displayed a bewildered expression. Captain? Why the 4th Division? From what I have seen of your report, you would be much more suited in the 11th. Yet you requested specifically to be placed here. I can't help but wonder, why? Naruto appeared to finally get the question, and a smile appeared on his face. Well, I don't really like fighting if I don't have to, and although I can't use Healing Kido, I would be happy to help in any other way possible, even cleaning. It sounds like you just spent the least 5 years training to be a Shinigami, only to become a cleaner? You do realize that the 4th Division is not the most respected, and you will be resigning yourself to ridicule from the other divisions. Also, despite us not being a combat-focused division, we are still sent out to the field for support. You might still be forced to fight. I understand, Captain Unohana, and I am willing to fight when needed, but until that time comes I would be happier under your command. Unohana reclined back in her chair, her gaze shifting to the blade on the blonde's hip as she laced her hands in front of her mouth to cover the little scowl. Tell me, San, from your report, you do not yet know the name of your Zanpakuto? That is correct, Captain. Then why, San, would you feel the need to wrap it in such a way that it cannot be drawn, an action I have only ever seen done by those that are afraid of their Zanpakuto? I think there is something you are not telling me, San. She didn't miss the way he tensed up, his eyes widening a little in terror before he caught himself, his hand moving as though to make sure the blade was still wrapped. I told you, Captain, I don't like fighting. Unohana rose slowly and walked around her desk to stand in front of Naruto, the younger Shinigami lowering his head to avoid eye contact. As it stands, I have no reason to refuse your request to join the 4th Division. However, I will be keeping a close eye on you, San, until I feel I can trust you. Naruto sighed and bowed low while grinning once again. Thank you, Captain Unohana. I promise I will prove myself to you. Unohana nodded as like nothing had happened, letting her typical smile slip across her lips, and then she turned to face the closed door. Aizen-san. As soon as she said the name, Aizen Kotetsu, the 4th Division's vice-captain at the time, emerged through the door. She stood behind Naruto at attention after making a low bow with one hand on her Zanpakuto. Captain. Aizen-san, please show San to his room, and starting tomorrow put him on the clean-up team. Of course, Captain. XXX. Compared to the rooms they had at the academy, the tiny room Aizen left Naruto in was more than adequate for him. On his left was a desk with a light leaning against the wall, and next the widow was a little bed with a view of the training ground. Aizen claimed that although the walls were white and the floor was plain wood, he was free to decorate it whatever he pleased. As she walked away, Naruto waited until he heard the vice-captain's footsteps diminish. When they were out of range, he let out a heavy sigh and his shoulders drooped a little. Naruto took the Zanpakuto from his hip, walked to his bed, and laid it down gingerly as though he was afraid it would blow up in his face. Then, he backed away and collapsed into his desk chair. Insolent woman, why did you let her talk to you like that? Naruto sighed again as he sank farther into his chair and turned it to face the bed, his gaze fixed on the sword. She's my captain and a good person, she deserves my respect. Respect? Ha! Where was her respect to you? Acting all high and mighty, looking down on you, you should have used me. In response to Zanpakuto's remarks, Naruto scowled, got to his feet, and walked to the opposite side of the room. Stop it! I will not attack my captain because you think she was rude. It would be stupid. Not if you use me. You know we could kill her, and every other worthless captain, if you would just use me. Naruto closed his eyes, put his head on the wall beside him, and pounded his fist while flinching. Stop it! I told you no, I will not use you. But Naruto-kun, I want to hunt, to feel blood running down my metal. Just a little, and I will stop asking, please. Naruto grabbed his pillow and slammed it on top of the bed after turning around and stomping over to it with a frown. Naruto sighed once more and sat down next to Zanpakuto on the bed, shifting the cushion to place his palm on the hilt. I said no, Kyubi-chan, I know what using you means, and if I have any other choice will not resort to that. Humph, you know when I told you my name I was expecting us to work together and kill all in our path. You're just lucky you're so cute. Naruto stood up, chuckled a little, and walked back to the desk chair, closed his eyes and allowing himself to go off to sleep. XXX. A week later, Unohana was standing outside her window, keeping a watchful eye on Naruto, intending to carry through on her threat, but she was only able to scowl at what she was witnessing. With Zanpakuto on his hip and a smile on his face, the blonde was currently sweeping the leaves from the training area into a pile. He was working more quickly than the other 3 members of her division who were assisting him with the assembly. Naruto had shown himself to be a machine during the week, working 3 times as fast as any other member assigned to the same task and never displaying signs of fatigue. If nothing else, his endurance was remarkable for a recent graduate. She was distracted from her work because she couldn't figure him out. She knew something wasn't right, but she couldn't do anything about it without proof. Captain Unohana, are you alright? Unohana, who had forgotten that she was not alone, blinked in surprise as she turned to face her vice-captain, who was wearing her typical smile and was looking anxious. I am fine, Isane-san, just a little distracted. Please tell me, what are your thoughts on San? Isane seemed a little taken aback, paused to reflect, and then shrugged her shoulders. He seems like a nice person from the short conversation we had when I was leading him to his room, polite, a little quiet maybe but nothing odd. Though I must admit I was surprised when I learned who he was, I'm not sure what I was expecting. Unohana's attention was drawn to the tall, silver-haired woman in front of her, and she motioned for her vice-captain to continue. Go on. Isane took a seat in front of the captain's desk and, with her hands on her lap in front of her, gazed about a little uneasily. Well, it's just, 4 years ago I remember several new recruits talking about him, about how he was so ruthless, a demon in battle that enjoyed fighting even the older students at the academy. They spoke of him in fear. But then the year after, I hear the next group of new recruits talking about how he just seemed to change, one day without warning. He stopped picking fights, and started wrapping his Zanpakuto in bandages and refused to draw it even for spares. Unohana paid close attention to all that was said, retaining it for further consideration, but Isane went on before she could respond. Then there was that instructor that was sent to use a year ago, the one with almost every bone in his body broken. I treated him myself. Apparently he tried to force San to draw his Zanpakuto for a spar against another student, but he went crazy and used it while still sheathed against him. He was embarrassed and asked me to put in my report that he fell down the stairs, but I remember it clearly. Unohana was shocked to see the big mound of leaves next to him, the others panting on the ground, and Naruto appearing as though he had simply taken a leisurely stroll as she turned her chair to face the blonde with a frown once more. I see, thank you Isane-san, I want you to keep an eye on San. Take him on as a training partner, make sure he knows it is by my orders, I want to know just how skilled he really is as a fighter. But Captain Unohana, he is a newly graduated Shinigami, I have many years' worth of experience over him. To expect me to train with him would be an insult to my honor. Unohana smiled and let out a little key, but she turned to face her vice-captain, who was frozen in her seat with a look of pure terror on her face. Isane-san, this is not a request, I want you to take San as your training partner, taking him under your wing and to find out just what he is hiding. From this day on he will be your shadow, understood? Isane nodded her head swiftly, got to her feet, and fled the room, Unohana laughing a little at what she saw. I still have it. XXX. Naruto took out the chore list he had been given after finishing the task of removing the leaves from the training ground. He crossed it off before moving on to the next task of the day. Clean the 10th Division's windows, shouldn't take too long. Naruto put the list back in his pocket and shook his head at the folks who were panting on the ground, ignoring them and accusing them of exhausting themselves in an attempt to keep up with him. San! The vice-captain's call halted him after he had only taken 3 steps. He turned to find her approaching him at a slow pace now that he was paying attention to her. Vice Captain Isane, is there something I can help you with? I was about to go clean the 10th Division's windows. Then after that I have to water the plants in the 2nd, clean the floors in the 6th and dust the 8th. Isane stopped in front of the blonde and shook her head, indicating the person who was least likely to faint while avoiding a look at the other people who were still panting on the ground. Give your list to him. Captain Unohana has asked me to train with you in order to evaluate your skills. You're also to be my shadow, so from now on you will be working with me. Naruto passed the list across without even glancing, reaching up to scratch the back of his head in response to his bewildered gaze. But I have no skill with healing Kido. I think I made things worse the last time I tried. Before I attempted to fix it, my partner only had a broken finger. After he had 3 broken fingers and a fractured arm. Isane soon recovered, shook her head, and put her palm on her Zanpakuto after letting out an uncomfortable laugh and letting a drop of perspiration fall on the back of her head. I heard about that actually, but that's not what we are training in. I am to be your training/sparring partner, so if you could follow me to the inside dojo. Hey, where are you going? Naruto snatched his list back as soon as she muttered sparring, and began to go while waving over his shoulder. Thanks, but I don't really need a sparring partner. I'm happy I'm cleaning duties. This is not a request, San. Captain Unohana has put you under my personal care, which means you will come with me now or risk being brought up on charges for insubordination. Naruto froze in place, weighing his options for a moment before he sighed, tossed his list back to the unidentified squad member, and turned back to Isane, his face displaying resignation. I understand, Isane-san. My apologies. Please lead the way. XXX. Isane nodded and took Naruto back into the barracks, down a few hallways before unlocking the door to a medium-sized dojo, all the while scowling a little at his attitude. Isane closed the door behind him, nodded to the mat, then took a position across from him and pulled out her Zanpakuto. Unwrap your Zanpakuto, San. We will start with a straight-up spar so that I can assess your skills before we move on to anything else. Every muscle in Naruto's body tensed up when she whispered, Unwrap. His hand shot to the handle as though to make sure the bandages were still in place. Then he turned back to the vice captain and swallowed. Would it be okay if I keep it sheathed? If I need to, I will draw it, but I do not feel comfortable pointing an uncovered weapon at a comrade. Isane frowned and considered it for a bit, then sighed wearily and shrugged her shoulders. It's fine, I guess, but remember I am a vice captain for a reason. No matter how skilled you may think you are still only a day out of the academy. Don't get cocky. Of course, Vice Captain Isane, I did not mean to sound arrogant. I really am just uncomfortable at the idea of drawing my Zanpakuto against a comrade. Naruto made a low bow and carefully withdrew his katana, sheath and everything, from its spot at his hip. They both fell into prepared positions without saying anything more, with Naruto slightly lower than Isane's with his Zanpakuto at his side insisting on being in front of her. Given that it wasn't a stance taught in the academy, the older Shinigami's eyes narrowed slightly. Where did he learn it then? She also didn't miss the strange expression that appeared in the blonde's eyes as soon as he removed the sword from his hip. It was as though they went from being innocent and brilliant to being lifeless and cold as soon as the weapon was in his grasp. If Isane were being really honest with herself, she would acknowledge that the appearance turned her off a little. What was she to worry about, though, when he was just a recent academy graduate and she was a vice captain with at least a century of experience ahead of him? They both leaped forward in response to an invisible cue, instantly reducing the distance between them. Isane was swinging at Naruto's side when the world whirled around her, and then she was looking up at him with her back on the ground and a bruise on the back of her skull. It happened so quickly that she didn't realize what had happened. With his katana back on his hip and an innocent grin on his face, he extended his hand to assist her in standing up again. Isane moaned, reached for the bruise on her head with one hand, slapped the hand away, and stood up. The silver-haired vice captain gave him a stern glance over her Zanpakuto as she hurried back to her spot on the other side of the mat, her voice suddenly much more professional and rigid. Again. Isane-san dash. Again. Naruto sighed as he removed his sheathed Zanpakuto from his hip once more, his gaze growing icy as soon as he held it. Isane didn't wait this time, charging ahead before Naruto could take his stance. However, she ended up on her back before she could even see him move. Isane-san, are you okay? Isane noted that the blonde had once again placed his Zanpakuto on his hip and extended his hand, which she once more swatted away, as she locked her slightly dazed gaze back on him. She looked to the blonde with a growl of displeasure, returning to her desire as the realization that she had lost to a recent graduate twice in a row began to weigh on her. Again! And stop putting away your Zanpakuto! Isane-san, please, I really don't want to do this dash. Run, Itagimo! Her shuriken unleashed 2 additional blades from the pommel with a little flare. Triple X. Being cautious not to be seen or heard, Unohana had been keeping an eye on the two from the door, and thus far, what she had witnessed had only caused her eyes to narrow. His movements were so graceful and quick that the untrained eye could not keep up with them. On both occasions, he just struck Isane in the head, causing her to become so confused that she fell to the ground. And as soon as she fell, he would swiftly put his sword back on his hip, as though he didn't think he could hold it for very long. The look in his eyes as he readied himself for battle, the instant Naruto's hand touched his Zanpakuto, a look she had only witnessed twice before. She could tell he had lied to her earlier when he said he didn't enjoy fighting because she had touched his blade with the intention of using it. Without a question, Naruto enjoyed fighting. In fact, he was afraid of how much he loved it. Zaraki Kenpachi had the same bloodlust-filled expression in his eyes that she had so many years earlier. She also heard him mention that he was uncomfortable at the idea of drawing his Zanpakuto against a comrade. Before they began, but again, that had not been the whole truth. He was afraid that if he lost control, he would harm a teammate. However, this didn't make sense for one reason: unlike her and Zaraki, he didn't have the tremendous spiritual pressure that accompanied the bloodlust. In fact, now that she looked more closely, she couldn't sense any spiritual pressure emanating from him at all, but that was impossible. The only explanation was that she couldn't see it because he was surprising it so much. What could have frightened the boy so much that he would make a special effort to resist his nature, which she was all too familiar with? She really detested the captain of the 11th Division because he was a continual reminder of what she had been, and what she could still be if she didn't resist her nature and let herself fall. It had taken her meeting the current Kenpachi to realize what she had become, what Zaraki was now. However, Naruto was so terrified that he began fighting before he had fully embraced his nature. Unohana's gaze unconsciously drifted to the tightly bandaged Zanpakuto at the blonde's hip. He treated it like a murderer, but as soon as he had an opportunity, he would put it back by his side, acting as though he was genuinely afraid of it and that it might bite him. Isane had informed her that Naruto had changed during his second year at the academy, refusing to use his blade for sparring and instead beginning to wrap it. The only explanation was that Naruto was so terrified of his Zanpakuto that he joined the 4th Division, just as she had attempted to do, after learning his name, what it could do, and what was inside of him. Unohana had the ability to leave a trail of blood and death wherever she went, which was unquestionably one of the most gory abilities, even after she realized the true nature of her Zanpakuto after achieving Bankai. Unohana was aware that it was a horrible weapon to use, even if it had never been formally registered to compare it to others. What did that say about Naruto's about him, if her Zanpakuto wasn't enough to shake her out of her bloodlust? Unfortunately, Unohana's eyes widened when Isane let go of her shirkai before she could consider the situation further. Her shy and compassionate vice captain, Isane, had just unleashed her shirkai in a fight with a free graduate. Frowning, Unohana yanked the door open and cried out, grabbing both Shinigami's attention after letting this continue for too long and realizing what she needed to do. Isane, that is enough, reseal your Zanpakuto this instant. She was not wearing her usual smile, and the harsh tone in her voice was so unusual that it caused the vice captain to lose her focus and make her Zanpakuto reseal itself. Both of them turned to stare at the captain in disbelief. Isane appeared to awaken from a trance, tossing her head a little before kneeling, her eyes wide. Captain Unohana, I didn't know you were there. I can see that, San. Go to my office and wait for me. Have something I need to discuss with you. Isane, stay here. I have something to say to you first. Naruto walked out of the room without saying anything, only bowing to the two women as he went by and shutting the door. With Ki in the air and her typical smile on her face, Unohana turned to face her vice captain as soon as his footsteps disappeared. Isane-san, explain. I don't know what came over me, Captain Unohana. I was just so angry that he was mocking me I acted without thinking. Isane felt like a little child receiving a reprimand from her mother, as the long-haired captain sighed and gave a little shake of her head. Isane-san, he was not mocking you. In fact, he was going out of his way to avoid it. San is not something you will ever be able to understand, and that is not a bad thing, but you must be more careful in the future. I understand, Captain Unohana. It will not happen again. Unohana nodded and started to walk out of the room, but she stopped and turned back to face her. I know it will not. Isane, you are an excellent healer, and you work hard to perfect your medical skills. However, I am sorry to say, Isane, because of your actions here I do not feel comfortable with you as my vice captain anymore. Not only has this proven that you have been neglecting your training, but your actions make me question your ability to make decisions. Please hand me your badge. With her eyes widening and tears streaming down her cheeks at what her captain had said, Isane leaned down carefully, took off her vice captain badge, and silently gave it to him. Triple X. Since he had just shown up with the vice captain in front of the captain, Nida's only thought while he waited in the captain's office was how much trouble he was going to get into. What would happen if she expelled him from the 4th Division? He would surely be transferred to the 11th, which would require him to resume regular combat. If that occurred, it would only be a matter of time until he was unable to even consider the possible outcomes. I don't know what you're so worried about, Naruto-chan. I think it would do us both good to feel the thrill of a good fight again. It's been so long, and I want to feel blood on my metal. You can't fight who you are forever. Naruto took a few long breaths and tried to relax, ignoring his Zanpakuto's words in his head. The door behind him opened just in time, allowing Captain Unohana to enter carefree and with a slight smile on her face, as if nothing had happened. She went over to her desk, sat down, and began rearranging a number of papers on it without even looking at him. They didn't say anything for the next 2 minutes, and just as Naruto opened her mouth to speak, the captain put her hand on the desk. The walls flashed blue, the doors behind him slammed shut with a crash, and the drapes closed over the widow behind her desk. Naruto opened his lips to speak, but Unohana interrupted him once more as his eyes widened and he glanced around the room. I have been patient with you this last week, San, despite my instincts telling me you were holding something back. But now I have reached my limit, and expect answers. I have sealed this room so nothing outside will know what is happening. If you continue to refuse, I will send you to a different division by the end of the day, understood? Naruto stared at his captain for a while, his expression a mix of acceptance and terror, and then he nodded slightly. Good, now release your spiritual pressure. Naruto was going to object, his eyes widening, but a tiny spike in Ki caused him to lower his head, the words dying on his lips. Of course, Captain. Naruto reached for his Zanpakuto and carefully removed it from his hip so as not to appear menacing. He then began to remove the bandages and let them fall to the ground. XXX. When the final bandage was taken off, Unohana's eyes widened in shock as the spiritual pressure abruptly filled the room, causing a number of objects to vibrate, and, in some cases, shatter. Her limbs seemed a little sluggish, and she was sitting in water as though a wave had crashed into her body. Although it didn't directly affect her, anyone below vice captain, possibly even captain rank, would undoubtedly be on their knees or worse. Her gaze shifted to the bandages as she realized what they must have been composed of. This was the final piece of the puzzle she needed to validate her assumptions. Unohana gestured for Naruto to sit in front of her while nodding her head, and the blonde did so after hesitating for a second. I was watching your spar with Isane-san from the start, San. You are very skilled, and from what I am feeling now you have the raw power to back it up. I also saw something that worries me, something in your eyes. Before it gave way to a profound melancholy, she observed the look of realization that came over his face in response to her remarks, indicating that he understood exactly what she was talking about. I see you know what I am talking about, good. Now tell me why you are hiding yourself in my division, when you should be placed somewhere that will cultivate your skills. As it stands, you have spiritual pressure to rival a captain, and from what I saw of your brief spar with Isane-san, at least high vice-captain skills. If this was known to others, you would be hailed as a prodigy the likes of Captain Hitsugaya. Naruto's hand glided gently across his still-sheathed Zanpakuto, which was now resting in his lap, without looking into her eyes. Unohana, not wanting to miss the action, scowled a little and leaned closer to examine the blade more closely. San, what is your Zanpakuto's name? Naruto appeared to struggle for a bit before his shoulders collapsed, and a sigh escaped his lips as he suddenly looked directly at her, his eyes wide with fright. Kurama, her name is Kurama. And what is it, exactly that Kurama does that has you so afraid you will not even use her while in her sealed form, San? Unohana briefly believed Naruto would remain silent as his eyes dropped to the ground, and he appeared to collapse on himself. But before she could inquire again, the blonde Shinigami raised his head and met her gaze. She hunts. Unohana frowned at the ambiguous response, and continued to look into his eyes before sighing and nodding her head. Very well, but one day I want you to either tell, or show me just what you mean by that. But until then, there has been a change of plans on who your training partner will be. Naruto looked at her the entire time as he reached down and began carefully rewrapping the bandages around his Zanpakuto, his face bewildered. Captain Unohana. Starting first thing tomorrow, I will be training you myself, in my private training ground away from the eyes of the rest of the 4th Division. Isane-san is not strong enough to challenge you. In fact, I am sure no one but myself in the 4th Division that can train with you. Naruto sat forward in his chair, gazing at Unohana as though she had grown a second head, his eyes expanding. When she put the vice-captain badge in front of him, they only grew bigger. Also, you will be wearing this from now on. I will explain everything you will need to know tomorrow. Wear it at all times, And be sure to act appropriately for your new position. There is a vice captain meeting every Thursday at 6 p.m. in the 10th Division barracks. Captain Unohana, I don't understand. What about Isane-san? Unohana grinned sadly as she sat back in her chair and let out a weary sigh. Isane-san is a good healer. She works hard in any and everything medical, but she is not a fighter. Nor is she a leader. Her usual shy personality makes her unfit to give orders, and from what I saw when you spared, she is not as level-headed as I thought her to be. You, however, despite being fresh out of the academy, are already at a vice-captain level. You can fight, even if you refuse to acknowledge it, and even though you have only been here a week, I have heard nothing but good things from the other members. Unohana briefly closed her eyes to consider how to phrase it, realizing that he was still perplexed. Yuzu, Naruto-san, as you know, the 4th Division is looked down on by the others. They think because we focus on things other than combat that we are cowards. For years they have treated my subordinates as less than trash, and no matter what I do, I am only one person. I need a strong vice-captain to prove the 4th Division is not weak, and I believe you are that person. I don't know, Captain Unohana, what would people say of you replacing Isane-san with a freshly graduated Shinigami? Also, I'm not even sure I can train anymore, even against someone as strong as you. Unohana scowled and got to her feet, smiling and allowing a little of her ki show. If I didn't know better, San, I would think that was arrogance. Naruto swiftly got to his feet and bowed low, his eyes widening in fear. I meant no disrespect, Captain Unohana. I merely meant that I cannot use my Zanpakuto on a fellow Shinigami, even in her sealed form. Kurama will hunt the blood of anyone she has tasted. Just one drop is all she needs. Unohana scowled at his remarks and nodded slightly, her mind racing with further questions regarding what exactly this young Shinigami's Zanpakuto did. After all, even in a spar with another captain in Bankai, she would never use her own against a fellow Shinigami. Very well, I will not ask you any more questions for now, but I am also not giving you a choice. You are the new vice-captain of the 4th Division, and you will meet me here tomorrow at 8 a.m. for training. Do not be late, Naruto-san. Unohana gave Naruto the vice-captain insignia without saying anything more, then returned her focus to the papers on her desk while the blonde walked away. The following day, Naruto arrived at the captain's office with 10 minutes to spare. He chose to wait for her to arrive because he didn't want to take the chance of her becoming upset with him once more. To put it mildly, the other 4th Division members' reactions upon seeing the vice-captain's emblem on his belt had been interesting. He heard them discussing it as they passed him, but most of them just appeared perplexed, unsure of what had happened but lacking the courage to challenge it. Others appeared upset, not like that a recent graduate had taken Isane's place, or that they had been ignored when they had been around longer. Not many people had congratulated him, and those who didn't look him in the eye. After Unohana had given him the badge yesterday, he had also run across Isane, and the silver-haired Shinigami had frozen when she saw it. Naruto felt awful as she turned her back on him and fled without saying anything, her eyes widening and tears streaming down her cheeks. He couldn't refuse his captain, but he didn't want any of this. Naruto was concerned that she was correct, but Kurama was enjoying it and appeared to believe that he would need to employ her soon due to his promotion. No matter how strong he was, Naruto couldn't kill a hollow without revealing his Zanpakuto, and vice-captains were always used in the field as a backup until more unranked Shinigami could be gathered. Naruto was startled out of his reverie by the sound of footfall approaching him. As soon as he saw Unohana turn the corner at the end of the hallway, he straightened up, one hand on his Zanpakuto and the other by his side. Captain Unohana. Unohana stopped a few feet in front of him, grinned, and nodded in recognition. Naruto-san, you are on time, good, we can get started then. Follow me, please. Naruto hurried to follow Unohana as she turned away from him and began to walk away without saying another word. She guided him into the barracks, which were bustling with activity despite the early hour because the 4th Division troops were always rising early for duties. After going for almost 5 minutes, they came to a locked door with a sign on the wall next to it that said only Captain Unohana may enter. He saw her take a key out of her robes and open the door, then move aside and signal for him to enter. When she followed, the door closed behind them. When Unohana flipped the light switch, Naruto could only look in shock because the room was too dark to see anything inside. He discovered himself standing in a massive training area that was at least 3 times as large as the one the rest of the 4th Division utilized, with lights shining all around. The uneven ground, which included a medium-sized pond and various rocks positioned at random, was designed to mimic a natural setting, making it more difficult to navigate unless you were paying attention. This room has the same protection as my office, meaning no one outside these walls can see, hear or feel what happens inside. I want you to unwrap your Zanpakuto again, and get into a stance. I need to judge your skills firsthand. With the same smile on her face, Unohana walked by him and stood in the center of the room, gently taking out her own blade and holding it out in front of her. Naruto took a step back without realizing it as his eyes widened and his hand rushed to his hilt. But Captain Unohana, I can't draw my Zanpakuto against you, I dash. I did not ask you to, Naruto-san, I asked you to get into a stance. You can keep your blade sheathed if you must, for now at least, but I want you to unbind it so I can evaluate your spiritual pressure while I test you. Naruto sighed, still not pleased with the state of affairs, nodded slightly, and removed the bandages. Similar to the previous day, Naruto's spiritual pressure erupted from his body as soon as the final piece of fabric fell away, quickly engulfing the entire room. His eyes briefly closed as the strain in his shoulders subsided, and he couldn't help but feel relieved. It wasn't the most comfortable sensation in the world to have his spiritual pressure continuously repressed. With his still-sheathed Zanpakuto in his hand, Naruto swiftly shifted to stand opposite his captain. Claiming it was the proper way to hold her, he assumed the identical position he had used against Aisane, which Kurama had taught him. With the exception of Unohana's brief nod at the beginning, either of them moved for a brief period of time as they stood in their positions and awaited the silent cue to begin. Naruto had no illusions about winning this spar because he knew he could do the same thing he had done against Aisane. This was a captain, after all. However, he was afraid that Unohana would not be pleased with him if he didn't at least attempt. When they hadn't moved after 5 minutes, Naruto eventually reached his breaking point and made his move by tensing his leg muscles. Naruto knew he wouldn't be able to just close it by sprinting over without leaving himself wide open because the area they were in was so much larger than the one he had confronted Aisane in the day before. Instead, he took a step and used Shunpa. Naruto shot his Zanpakuto at the side of Unohana's head as soon as he was in front of her, who appeared completely unsurprised. Naruto stumbled a little as he lost his balance, but Unohana easily raised her blade to stop it before rerouting it to the right. Naruto quickly recovered and used another Shunpa to escape before she could attack, only to discover that she had not moved an inch after deflecting his blow. You can do better, Naruto-san, I know you can, so stop holding back and come at me. Naruto shook his head to get rid of the bloodlust that accompanied her words and attitude, as well as the quick rush of adrenaline that rushed through his body. He then shunpoed across to her again, this time appearing on her left side. His eyes widened in horror as it was wiped aside by the back of her palm, causing him to lose his balance once more. He had targeted a strike for her ribs, shifting his body slightly to gain more speed and power behind it. Naruto shunpoed away once again and emerged, gasping and sweating, gritting his teeth and holding the side of his head with one hand. He wasn't exhausted, on the contrary, he was trembling from the rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. Naruto closed his eyes for a moment to collect himself before returning his gaze to Unohana. With a guttural battle cry exiting his lips, he leapt into the air above her this time, holding his Zanpakuto above his head as he brought it down on hers with all of his strength. This time, however, Unohana chose to step back and totally evade the strike, which caused it to strike the ground and leave a tiny creation in its wake. A tiny dagger sprang from her sleeve and struck him in the left shoulder before he could push Shunpa away once more. Naruto gasped a little and reappeared on the opposite side of the room, trying to control the blood flow with one hand on his shoulder. Every time he moved the knife, Naruto could feel the metal grinding on the bone. The pain was severe. The knife had penetrated all the way to the hilt and was lodged between his shoulder joints. His eyes widened as he took his palm away and stared at the blood coating it, unable to look away as a few droplets fell to the ground. XXX. Unohana had been waiting for this moment, yet Naruto's eyes had remained expressionless till now, indicating that he was still holding back. She had observed how he was battling his bloodlust and had been searching for his trigger, the thing that would send him off and release it. However, Unohana knew she had located it the instant he saw the blood on his hand, and that the spar was going to turn much more exciting. She saw his body start to tremble with repressed excitement, his eyes expanding painfully, and his breathing became more labored. He gently turned away from his hand and caught her eyes, his lips slowly pulling back into a broad smile that revealed all of his teeth. Now Naruto-san, show me the real you, show me everything. Unohana's smile widened even more as he saw the sheath fly off his Zanpakuto with a quick flick of his wrist, striking the wall and tumbling to the ground. Hee hee. With Zanpakuto on his side, he assumed a low stance, bending at the knees and leaning forward. As he stiffened his leg muscles, the ground beneath his feet began to groan and splinter, and the spiritual pressure in the air became even thicker, reaching twice its previous level and continuing to rise. With his Zanpakuto already in mid-swing, Naruto's shunpoing suddenly appeared in front of her as the ground beneath his feet erupted. Even though it was excellent, it was still insufficient, and Unohana easily deflected it away from her, sending sharks flying with both blades as soon as they made contact. Naruto stumbled as she flicked her wrist, sending another knife flying from her sleeve into the back of his right calf. But Naruto didn't exhibit any further symptoms of discomfort, unlike when she had last struck him with one of her knives. He appeared to dismiss it in a matter of seconds, turning around and swinging at her once more without even trying to draw the blade. His smile remained unwavering. Naruto immediately swung around, putting all of his weight on his left leg, and swung his other leg limply in the direction of her tummy. After deflecting the blade once more, Unohana took a step back and used her free hand to kick the blonde in the damaged leg. Unohana did not throw a knife this time. Instead, she clutched it in her hand and slashed, striking his right forearm and sending blood flying. However, she soon discovered that Naruto was unharmed by his wounds, much like Zaraki and herself. In actuality, they appeared to only strengthen him, as his bloodlust was stoked by the sight of his own blood. She wondered what would happen if he came across someone else's blood. Unohana used her palm to deflect a swing that was headed for her neck, making it go up, before she could think about it further. With the knife remaining in her hand, she used this opportunity to slash his face, cutting his forehead once again and spilling his blood before kicking him away. When the blood from the cut she just gave him flowed down his face, his tongue darted out and caught a little as it reached his cheek, and he landed on his feet after correcting himself in midair, his grin still intact and his eyes bloodshot with excitement. She scowled at what she saw. She had only intended to excite him enough to witness his bloodlust in action, but if this continued, he would wind up in a hospital bed by the end of the spar. This was going too far. As it was, she could still readily treat him because the injuries he had already sustained were slight and bleeding. However, if they didn't stop right away, he would just become more enthusiastic and might even let go his shiki, which Unohana knew from his behavior prior to the spar wouldn't be beneficial for training in the future even though she was still intrigued in it. But she also understood that Naruto would not be able to stop in his current condition. Unohana quickly came up with a plan and waited for him to charge at her once more before swerving at the last second and slamming her Zanpakuto's butt into the back of his head. Before hitting the ground, Naruto was asleep. His blade skidded across the floor and stopped 10 feet away, next to one of the boulders. Unohana sighed and put her Zanpakuto back in its sheath on her hip before approaching the blonde Shinigami in a composed manner. Thinking about what she had discovered about the blonde, she took a moment to examine his wounds before tending to them one at a time after taking out both of her knives and putting them back in her sleeve without even cleaning them. It was just as she had imagined. Naruto shared Zaraki's and her unparalleled spiritual pressure and bloodlust. She, Zaraki, and Naruto were the only persons she had encountered who had this ailment, which manifested itself randomly. They had unrivaled sheer power from birth, but they also had a passion and thirst for combat that made them prioritize it over all other pursuits. It was just as much of a cure as it was a blessing. Unohana was somewhat relieved that Naruto was under her care rather than that man's, as she was aware of the consequences of his influence. Like her and Zaraki, Naruto was destined to play a significant role in the Seriidii, if nothing else. She would at least be able to guide him in a different direction than they had, perhaps even teaching him how to restrain his bloodlust. She smiled a little at the concept, and moved him to the wall, and propped him up against it after making sure he was fully recovered. XXX. After 10 years. XXX. Like he had been instructed, Naruto stood silently behind his captain in the meeting, keeping his back straight and wearing a little smile that resembled hers. Apart from training and learning about his responsibilities as a vice captain, not much had changed in the previous 10 years. Despite the paperwork making him wince, Naruto was glad to have joined the 4th Division. The only significant setbacks since he was appointed vice captain were his initial encounters with the other vice captains and his summons to a captain's meeting. Even less than his division, a number of his fellow vice captains disapproved of Aisen's replacement and first treated him coldly out of resentment, accusing him of being the reason behind her demotion. Thankfully, when they genuinely took the time to get to know him, that had changed. But for the most part, the captains did not seem to like him, mostly because Unohana had given him a promotion without providing any explanation other than that they should trust her judgment. Naruto was certain that he would have at least been compelled to spar with one of the other vice captains by now to demonstrate his abilities if nobody was so terrified of her. Indeed, Unohana had ensured that he could spar with her alone, and only in her own training facility. Other than giving him the occasional piece of advice during a battle, she never really taught him anything. Instead, they would scrap for hours on end. After every battle, Naruto would awaken unconscious, his clothes smeared with blood, and all of his wounds healed. In the 10 years they had been practicing, he had never once even considered scratching her skin, which Naruto was more than pleased about. He still feared it, even though he hadn't let his shiki loose against her or any other Shinigami in at least a decade. He would always be thankful that Unohana had never made him show her, even though he knew she was curious. His captain had been pulling strings to keep Naruto off the front line, so to speak, and he had never even been called into the field. Even while it wasn't the same as facing a hollow, he used the time to hone his fighting abilities and gain more combat experience. However, that was going to change. He and Unohana, as well as 2 11th Division soldiers, were being sent to the edge of Soul Society. A number of hollow were reportedly seen in the vicinity, and at least one of them was thought to be in Ajuchas. Ikuku Madarame and Yumichika Ayasegawa, who currently held the 3rd and 5th seats in the 11th Division, respectively, did not appear very pleased about being dispatched with him. Unohana was merely providing support, and would not engage in combat until absolutely necessary. Naruto was just shocked that it hadn't happened sooner because he understood what was going on and why he was being sent out. Unohana believed it was time for him to reveal himself to the Godai 13 because she had essentially ran out of favors and wasn't going to keep him concealed any longer. On his mission, he was aware that at least one 2nd Division member would be following them and reporting on everything that transpired. When Unohana noticed him looking at her, she gave him a slight nod that confirmed his suspicions and was clearly aware of what he was thinking. It was also her way of notifying him that it was time for him to come out of hiding. Naruto ignored those ideas for the time being and concentrated on the Captain Commander as he assigned them their task. It has been reported that a number of hollow, at least one of them being in Ajuchas, have been sighted in the East 56th district of Rakangai. You 4 are to go and investigate, and deal with any hollows you may or may not find, before returning. Captain Unohana will be accompanying you, but will only intervene if she feels you need her assistance, and will be keeping me up to date of what is happening. From our last report, it is estimated that there are 5 hollow working in a group, and as I already said, at least one of them is Ajucha's level from what the 12th Division scanners have been about to pick up. To demonstrate that they understood, they all nodded their heads. Good, you are all dismissed. XXX. It was a long trip to Rakangai's East 56th district. Ikaku's tirade about wanting to fight and Yamachika's praise of his beauty while gazing into the hand mirror he brought made it seem like it was to Naruto, at least. Nor did it help that they were both extremely outspoken about how cowardly they believed the majority of the 4th Division were, and that meant Naruto probably didn't even know how to utilize his Zanpakuto. Naruto would have knocked them both out in the first 5 minutes if it hadn't kept holding his shoulder to stop him. Ikaku's bloodlust had only grown stronger over the past 10 years, and battling Unohana every day seemed to just intensify it, so talking about fighting wasn't helping either. He wanted nothing more than to grant Kurama's demand and pit her against the fearless Shinigami, but he wouldn't do that against a friend, no matter how obnoxious they were. The mere prospect of a fight would make his blood race. They arrived at their target, a little village just an hour's walk from the last sighting, on the border between the 55th and 56th districts, after 2 days of travel. With its dilapidated houses and a single, uneven road with several potholes, it wasn't much to look at. Although they didn't look particularly pleasant, the people were courteous enough. Since they arrived shortly before dusk, they chose to stay the night in the village's only hotel rather than leaving immediately. The elderly woman who owned it was pleasant, but it wasn't actually a hotel. Rather, it was a slightly larger house with 2 extra rooms that you could rent for the night. To their regret, Naruto and Unohana had to share a room because there were only 2, but it was preferable to sharing with either of their other traveling companions. Using a blanket that the owner had allowed him to use, Naruto slept on the floor throughout the night, demanding that his captain take the bed. The majority of the hamlet, who were earning a living by cultivating the fields nearby, woke up with the sun the following morning and, after paying for their lodgings, left at a leisurely pace for the 56th district. Arriving at their location took longer than they had anticipated. Walking up a mountain had significantly slowed them down, especially since they weren't employing Shunpa to conserve energy for the hollows. The terrain became tougher and the forest thicker as they approached, making it nearly impossible to see where they were going. This just made it harder to move forward, and eventually they came out into a small clearing. It was evident they were in the correct location because there were multiple broken trees and some slightly ripped dirt. As Ikaku dashed forward with his sword out and a smile on his face, Naruto stood beside his captain and could only shake his head in surprise at the brave man's realization that there were no hollows in the area. "Hey, where are they?" Naruto sighed and turned to face his captain, asking for her approval before moving ahead when she gave him a little nod. He nodded to himself as he walked around the clearing, stooping to examine a few broken branches or footprints. Naruto had always been skilled at tracking, a talent that Unohana had pushed him to hone over the past 10 years, even before he began at the academy. They left about 2 hours ago, traveling north-northwest. 5 sets of prints, 2 belonging to 4-legged creatures, 2 belonging to 2-legged and the last with a serpent-like tail. Based on the fact that several of the higher branches on the 3s are broken, and that there is only 4 sets leaving the clearing, one of them is a flyer. The 2 4-legged hollows are heavy and powerful, based on the deep impressions in the ground, but will most likely be slow. The flying is one of the toe-legged, and the other is light on his feet, so speed-based. Unfortunately, I can't tell much about the snake tail. Its weight is evenly distributed so there isn't much of an impression, but it is long. When Naruto looked up, he saw his captain grinning and Ikaku and Yumachika looking horrified. A minute or so passed before the battle-crazy Shinigami could speak. "How the hell do you know all that? I thought this was supposed to be your first time in the field." Taking a cue from his captain, Naruto smiled a little, naively, but without the intention of killing. "I'm good at tracking." Nuda moved to stand beside Unohana once again and, with one hand on his Zanpakuto, gestured in the direction they needed to walk. We should be able to catch up to them within the hour. They are traveling as aground and the two four-legged hollows will probably slow them down because of the thick foliage. When we meet up with them, I would suggest you two deal with them quickly, while I keep an eye out for the flyer. The other two-legged and snake-tail we can deal with as needed. They both gave him odd looks, and for a second Nuda thought they wouldn't pay attention and dismiss what he had to say. However, after exchanging glances, Yumachika and Ikkaku both shrugged and began to move in the direction he indicated. XXX. As Nuda had anticipated, they caught up to the group of hollows in less than an hour, and as they approached, the track became simpler to follow. Additionally, he had been correct about their appearance, and how the two four-legged hollows had slowed them considerably. However, they were now unable to view the flyer. With blue stripes on its mask and 2-foot-long tusks facing front, the first appeared to be a massive boar-type hollow, standing a head taller than Nuda himself. The second was an equally enormous bull-type hollow with red markings on its mask, but it had a third horn that curved forward from the top of its head rather than just two. The snake-like creature was just that, a snake-like hollow with 3 heads and a spike on the end of its tail that resembled a sword. With the exception of the mark's colors, which were green, black, and brown from left to right, every mask had the identical appearance. The last member of the group they could see had a long neck and a human-like shape and proportions, but was so thin that it appeared to be nothing more than bones. With foot-long spikes emerging from both knees and elbows, long bone fingers that ended in claws, and a segmented tail twice as big as its body with a bladed tip, it was all pointed and sharp. The rear of its skull tapered off into a 2-foot-long curving spike, and the rest of its foot went straight into its leg as it stood on 3. They had stopped in a field to make it easier for the bull and boar to move, and they were obviously waiting for them. As soon as they entered the field, both four-legged hollows came at them at full speed, their horns ready to gore and their heads down. Ikkaku and Yumachika both charged at them without saying anything, the brazen Shinigami grinning broadly and the other smirking slightly. Nuda shifted his concentration from the two and their altercation to his own when Hollow, the snake, passed in front of him, all 3 heads moving erratically and hissing at him. He took a step back without even pulling out his Zanpakuto, evading the bladed tail that came over their heads and was aiming for his chest, causing it to sink into the earth at his feet. Nuda went forward once more, pounding his foot on the tail hard enough to break off the bladed end without averting his gaze from the head. The snake Hollow screamed in agony and rage, wrapping its wounded tail into a coil behind it as it dragged its tail back and snapped at him with its right head. Nuda took another step back, snatched up his Zanpakuto, and as he positioned himself, he smacked the head that had hit him with the sheath. Nuda-san, unbind your Zanpakuto! Nuda paused in his posture, looked at his captain with astonished eyes, and then returned his focus to the Sake Hollow when the left and middle heads impacted him. Nuda closed his eyes for a time and sighed, scowling at himself for becoming sidetracked. Nuda grabbed the end of the covering, launched his Zanpakuto into the air, and pulled hard, causing the bandages to unwind and spinning quickly enough to create a slight breeze. As soon as the bandage was taken off, his spiritual pressure flooded the area, causing everything to pause and stare at him in disbelief while he snatched his Zanpakuto from the air. Nuda instantly turned as soon as he had it in his grasp, flipping his wrist to send his sheath flying to the side where it lodged itself in a tree. Nuda's hair abruptly cast a shadow over his face, and he smiled broadly as he gave way to his bloodlust, exactly as Unohana had instructed him to do. The snake-like Hollow flinched in terror when he raised his head again, not seeming to desire to fight after noticing the ravenous expression in his eyes. Nuda suddenly surged forward, slashing his sword at the right head as he shot out, grabbed the left head, and pulled it forward. The middle head, which was the only one free, screamed in agony as the right was cut and fell to the ground with a moist sound, slapping Nuda in the face with several bloodstains. Nuda pulled sharply, hoisted the snake-like Hollow over his head, and slammed it into the ground in a display of power, his smile widening at the act of violence. After the force left a big crater, he proceeded to chop the 2 remaining heads in half all the way down the body in a single move by bringing his Zanpakuto down on the joint where they united. Nuda threw the now-head Hollow aside as it began to break apart, his body now smeared in much more blood than before, and his gaze met the boar's as if Hollow Yumachika were engaged in combat. Nuda flipped his blade so that he held it more like a spear and flung it directly toward the Hollow's throat, pursuing it as soon as it was out of his grasp. When his Zanpakuto dug into the boar's neck, forcing it to squeal in anguish, Nuda leaped into the air, grabbed his hilt as he sailed over it, and used the momentum to cut its head from its shoulders, ignoring the shocked expression on the 11th Division 5th seat. At this moment, the flying Hollow appeared for the first time. With a 20-foot wingspan, a long, bony tail, and 3 clawed claws on each foot, it resembled a human-sized bat. Though its mask lacked eye holes, it did have 2 gigantic ears on either side of its head and a pair of 2-foot-long fangs that curved down from its lips. It also featured crimson markings, flaring nostrils, and a small, snout-like nose that occupied the majority of its face. Before anyone could stop it, it swooped down from the sky, grabbed the blonde Shinigami by the shoulders with its clawed feet, and lifted back into the air. Naruto was sent 100 feet into the air in a matter of seconds, with the bat-like hollow's long tail encircling his neck like a snake. Despite this, he continued to smile as he thrust his Zanpakuto up and into its ribcage. The bat hollow let out an eye-splitting scream as it realized it had Naruto in its grasp. He dropped him as it attempted to escape, but he caught its tail as he fell. When the hollow lost its balance, it and Naruto tumbled back into the field and landed with a thump in the center of the gap between the human-like hollow and the other Shinigami. Naruto pulled hard again as soon as his boots touched the ground, whirling the bat hollow around by its tail before releasing his grip and launching it into a tree. Hee, you're stronger than I expected, Shinigami Scrum. I'll enjoy ripping the flesh from your bones. Just in time, Naruto raised his Zanpakuto and confronted the human-like hollow, its claws inched from his throat and restrained by his Zanpakuto. The blonde Shinigami's eyes were bloodshot and wide, and he licked his lips in delight as his grin stretched to an unfathomable extent. So you're the Ajuchas. I was hoping I'd get to fight you. Two briefly vanished from view as they pulled away, then reappeared 20 feet apart. The hollow, crouching low, was about to charge once more when it felt the spiritual pressure in the air suddenly double in magnitude. It then became visible as red wisps of energy, and was drawn into Naruto's Zanpakuto. It kept getting drawn in until the sword could handle it no longer, and it began to enter Naruto instead. The power gradually increased in strength every second until it resembled a massive, smiling fox head, with Naruto standing inside. Naruto quietly raised his Zanpakuto in front of his face and grasped the blade's base with his left hand, while his countenance abruptly became much more composed. With the exception of the wind howling as the spiritual pressure was still being drawn into the blonde, everything was silent since Ikaku had already destroyed the bull hollow. Then Naruto spoke 2 words and jerked his palm up his own blade, leaving a trail of blood in the process. Hunt Kurama! Everyone who saw Naruto was dazzled by the light that radiated from him, and everything was blown away from him as the fox head exploded outward with a gust of wind. Unohana skidded back from the power, leaving 2 little pits in the earth where her feet dug in, forcing her to protect her eyes like everyone else. She had been eagerly waited for the fight that would lead Naruto to release his shuriken for at least 10 years, knowing that no matter how hard she pushed him in their sparring, he would never use it against her. He would always respond with, "Hunt," but she hadn't even been able to get him to explain what it did. After all, a Zanpakuto was an extension of the Shinigami's soul, as much a part of them as they were it, and for some, it was a difficult thing to face. It appeared that he was as terrified of what people would think of him because of what his Zanpakuto could do as he was of using it against another Shinigami. However, Unohana made sure to absorb every aspect of her vice-captain's shuriken and committed every line to memory as the light eventually dimmed and the wind created a little cloud of dust. Blood-red gauntlets had taken the place of his sword and the sleeves of his Shinigami robe. They appeared to be constructed of thousands of 2-inch-long metal needles, giving them the appearance of fur, and they joined across his back and covered his arms to his shoulders. A tiny, claw-like scythe on each finger's tip was made of a deep black metal that appeared to absorb light. His hands appeared to be many times their usual size, and his arms appeared to have grown approximately 2 feet longer, yet it didn't appear to be affecting his balance. 3-foot-long needles framed his head on either side of each shoulder where the gauntlets ended. A line drawn from the same red needles ran down his spine in the center of his shoulder blades where the two joined. It then continued into a long, bushy foxtail that was twice as long as his torso and swayed as though it were genuine. When the dust eventually cleared, she saw Naruto crouched like an animal, his gaze fixed on the hollow before him, his teeth bared in a growl. The needles would softly click together with each movement, creating an almost rattling sound. Fortunately for the hollows, it only retreated a single step before regaining its self-assurance, and crouching down with its clawed hands by its sides. However, Unohana was unable to look away from Naruto, his new tail waving behind him and his arms wrapped in shuriken. It was too sophisticated for a shuriken, and it felt and looked more like a bankai, so that didn't make sense. Although she still didn't understand why he was so hesitant to use it, she was aware that it had something to do with blood and that she wouldn't be able to witness its effects until he made a deep enough cut in the hollow to obtain some. Unohana was even more enthralled by Naruto's appearance than she was, as seen by the 2 members of the 11th Division who moved to stand to her right, their jaws and eyes wide with shock. In the air surrounding them, she could still feel his spiritual pressure pressing against her body and soul. However, it also felt calmer and more in control than when he gave in to his bloodlust, which actually caused her some concern. They appeared to be standing in the storm's eye at this point. Naruto and the hollow both vanished from view at an invisible signal, only to resurface in the center as they clashed. Seemingly equal in power, their clawed hands met at the same moment, blasting a gust of wind forth from their bodies. In response to the fight, the needles shook even louder, as though they were anticipating the blood they would soon feel. Sparks flew into the air where their claws met as they parted ways and briefly charged at one another. Naruto used his left hand to aim a swipe at the hollow's chest, but the blade on the end of its tail stopped him, leaving severe scratches from his metal claws. Naruto leaped back, tucked his arms tightly at his sides, and began rolling forward so quickly that his body turned into a crimson blur. The blonde Shinigami's body transformed into a wheel of death while the fur beneath him tore the ground apart like needles. Then, as if fired from a cannon, it blasted toward the hollow. It managed to leap to the side, narrowly escaping collision, and Naruto proceeded to demolish 3 trees. In a matter of seconds, the whirling Shinigami tore through them like paper, ripping them into splinters before turning wide and returning to the hollow. The Ajuchas kept avoiding but failing to attack without getting snagged by the needles for a few minutes until Naruto eventually stopped spinning. The hollow sprang forward, his clawed fingers aimed at his face as soon as he did. When Naruto raised his needle-covered arm to block, he only veered to the right. They ultimately found themselves facing each other once more, and as one charged at the other simultaneously, they met in the center. They clasped hands once more, pressing against one another in a struggle for supremacy. The tails then emerged from above their owner's head, only to collide in midair and form a knot in a struggle for supremacy. More than the clawed hands still clasped together, they twitched frantically, pushing and pulling against one another. They both growled and withdrew simultaneously, but they did not untangle their tails. Their tails appeared to lengthen to make room for the new distance between them as they both dropped into nearly similar crouching positions on the ground while on all fours. The two tails engaged in a strength-based battle for approximately a minute, with Naruto and the hollow hopping around on all fours in an attempt to outmaneuver the other. However, it was broken as Naruto's arms looked to tremble and then moved down his spine and along his tail as the needles began to rattle louder than previously. Every needle that made up the fur-like armor abruptly stood on end, and the only warning was the sound they produced as they clicked against one another. Unohana realized what had happened in an instant. The hollow let out a cry of agony and withdrew its tail, leaving a little pool of blood on the ground from the tiny pinpricks the needles had made. It curled its tail over itself and glared at the blonde as it briefly retreated from Naruto like a wounded animal. "Is that all you can do? A few tiny pinpricks aren't going to kill me!" Naruto rose from his squat and stood erect, his arms extended at his sides and his face expressionless. "One drop is all it takes for the hunt to begin, one drop on her metal, and Kurama will never forget your taste. She will hunt you no matter where you go, no matter how far you run. Even if you killed me now, she will still kill you after I am gone. You are already dead, you just don't know it yet." The rattling of the needles became louder than ever when Naruto thrust his arms forward in a dramatic motion on the final phrase, and then they stopped. The field fell silent for a time as everyone's attention was fixed on Naruto. Then all of the needles suddenly sprang out of his body at once, soaring skyward in all directions. They moved in unison, gathering above Naruto's head in a manner that Unohana found reminiscent of a particular captain's zanpakuto, before launching themselves forward. However, Unohana could swear that they briefly assumed the form of a smiling fox head before they moved. However, everyone was taken aback by what transpired next since, unlike Hollow, the needles did not aim toward the human, rather they went straight by him, splitting from him like water around a rock. But before anyone could figure out what had gone wrong, there was an ear-piercing scream that sounded like a shriek. Unohana felt her eyes widen a little as she looked away from the Hollow and her vice-captain to see the bat-like Hollow that had reportedly still been alive. Even with her own Zanpakuto Bankai, Unohana had never felt sorry for a Hollow in pain, but she winced at the sight of the bat Hollow. Every inch of the beast, including the areas covered in armor made of bone, had been punctured by the needles, which tore it to pieces and pinned what remained to the tree it had been standing in front of. Unohana finally realized why Naruto would never use his unsheathed Zanpakuto against another Shinigami at that point, as she pieced together all the clues he had ever given her regarding its capabilities and the reasons behind his fear of doing so. Like a bloodhound, Kurama would risk whatever she smelled, starting with the newest. As she had just witnessed, Kurama would use any blood that came into contact with her metal, thus Naruto didn't even need to let go of his shurikai. They would just go after their victim's blood, so he didn't even need to, or perhaps couldn't, direct the needles himself. It was strange that Naruto had to cut himself in order to free her, but Unohana could only surmise that it was a cost of wielding such a potent weapon and that he was the only one not affected by the hunt he had been discussing. Unohana saw the needles rip themselves out of the now disintegrating bat hollow and returned to the air like a swarm of enraged hornets as they gathered together while these thoughts went through her mind. As the needles shaped into a smiling fox head with long, rabbit-like ears, she was certain this time. The human-like hollow abruptly fled into the forest, as if realizing the peril it was in. It moved quickly, running on the ground and swinging from branches, disappearing before anyone could stop it. Naruto didn't appear concerned, and it was then that Unohana saw that the tiny claws that resembled a scythe were still attached to him, having shifted to rest on the tips of his fingers. He merely observed as the fox-shaped needles pivoted to confront the escaping Ajuchas, then exploded back into a swarm, shooting off and chasing. No, not chasing. Before they too vanished into the distance, she observed as they passed through the trees without making contact with them, the only sound being the faint rustling sound they produced when they touched. In a matter of seconds, the unhappy creature let out a cry of agony and terror as the needles caught up to it. However, the sound was abruptly cut off as silence returned, and then the needles rattling resumed. Unohana briefly feared she was mistaken and that they would murder Naruto as they sprang out of the woods and began to circle him without making contact with his skin. The needles were rattling and darting in and out around him, like an exuberant puppy playing with its owner. Subsequently, they all began to glow before combining, reverting to their sealed state, and the sword striking the ground at Naruto's feet, blade first. XXX. Ha! Who would have thought a 4th Division work monkey could be a real fighter? I mean, the ending was less exciting, but at the start when you were fighting head-on, that was great. Naruto kept his head down while Ikkaku talked about the fight, trying to avoid the brave, delighted Shinigami who wrapped his arm around his shoulders and pulled him into a one-armed hug. And that light show! I've only ever seen Captain Kenpachi do anything like that. You got to tell me how you did it! Unohana pulled them both out of the conversation before Naruto could come up with a response, since he truly didn't want to publicly acknowledge that he was the same as the captain of the 11th Division. I think you have asked my vice-captain enough questions, Madarame-san. We are almost at the village. Tomorrow, after a good night's sleep, we will return to the Siriidii and give our report to the captain commander. Ikkaku removed his arm from the blonde and walked with his companion, who was staring into a mirror once more, frowning but still nodding in comprehension. Then, with Unohana in front, Ikkaku and Yumichika behind, and a still blood-soaked Naruto in the center, they proceeded in quiet. Strangely, he had completely forgotten about the blood, despite the fact that it still stained his body and clothing after the other hollows had destroyed. Perhaps it was meant to be symbolic, as he now appeared to be on the outside rather than the inside. The locals' responses when they eventually reached the village were predictable, but the glances were nonetheless painful. He turned away every time he saw them out of wide-eyed horror, since it reminded him of things he didn't want to think about. The same rooms were available to them as before, but the elderly woman who owned them wouldn't let Naruto in until he had taken a bath and had even taken his clothing to wash. She didn't even know his name, and Naruto was shocked, but she pretended to be a strict grandma while everyone else appeared to be afraid of his blood-stained figure. That notion made the blonde grin a little as he relaxed for the first time since the struggle and immersed in the bath after washing away all of the dried hollow blood from his skin and hair. Using his shuriken required very little effort, which was another reason he feared it, not because he was physically exhausted. No, he was troubled by the thought that everyone would know by the time he got back to the Siriidii. A Zanpakuto was the Shinigami's corporeal embodiment. All that contributed to their identity was encapsulated in their blade. What, then, made Naruto? A hunter? A murderer? Although Kurama would always remember a person's blood and could return to it, he was aware that learning how to cancel a hunt would require training. Since the only way to gain control was for something to die each time he realized his shuriken, how can he practice with something that demands killing? He thought about utilizing animals, but it didn't feel right to him because Seoul society had so little cattle and so many people without adequate food. These ideas had been bothering him since he first heard Kurama's name, but after years of contemplation, Naruto decided it would be best if he simply didn't utilize her at all. She could not hunt if she didn't taste blood, and she couldn't kill if she couldn't hunt. However, since he had used his shuriken in public, he would be requested to use it once more, thus that was no longer an option. Naruto was certain that Central 46 would want him to fight if it weren't for the captain commander. With a sigh, the blonde got out of the bathtub and grabbed a towel before heading to the door. He swiftly changed after making sure no one was observing him and taking the fresh clothes that were waiting for him in the hallway, even though they weren't his. Naruto headed to the room he would be sharing with his captain once more, now wearing a plain gray short-sleeved shirt and slacks. He had hoped that she would have fallen asleep by now, but his hopes were dashed when Naruto opened the door and discovered Unohana waiting for him on the bed. Everything appeared black and white, with the full moon beaming through the open window and providing the sole illumination. She was waiting for him with her hand resting calmly in her lap, her eyes closed, and the same smile she always had on her face. Captain Unohana. When she remained silent, Naruto entered the room, shut the door, and then moved gently to the floor blanket where he would be sleeping once more. He waited for her to speak while keeping his back to her and making it more comfortable with motionless movements. I understand now why you always refused to release your shuriken in our spars, and were so afraid to cut someone. She killed the bat hollow first, because even though it was while she was in her seal's form, its blood had touched her metal. You told me on more than one occasion that her power was to hunt, but until today I never understood what you meant, but now I do. Naruto turned slowly and saw Unohana's eyes, which were now open, staring at him. Such a simple concept, yet so dangerous. Tell me, is it that you can't stop her once she has tasted blood, or that you have not trained with your shurikai enough? Naruto sat gently on the blanket with his eyes on the ground and his Zanpakuto resting on his lap. In theory, I should be able to learn how to stop a hunt, but Kurama would always be able to track them. But how can I train when every time I do something would need to die? I can't even use animals, because there is never enough food to begin with, and if I start killing livestock it would only get wars OW. With a smile on her face, Unohana suddenly materialized in front of him and gave the blonde a back of the head slap while towering over him. If you had just told me sooner, I could have helped you, Naruto-san. In fact, I could have helped you gain control by now, but instead you gave up and tried to hide it. I don't understand. Jigai, Naruto-san, are manufactured human bodies. Empty shells, of course, but even when empty they function like a really body. They breathe, they digest food, and they have a heartbeat. Naruto could only look at his captain in disbelief, his jaw hanging open as his eyes became wide at what he was being told. Unohana placed her hand on the top of his head and ran it through his hair while maintaining her smile. XXX. Because they were using Shunpa for the most of the journey and didn't need to conserve energy, the return trip went more quickly. Additionally, Naruto didn't have to put up with Ikaku's constant insults. Even after stating that it would kill him, the persistent inquiries and demands for a fight were annoying, but they just seemed to energize the fearless Shinigami. The typical war freak from the 11th Division, not that Naruto could actually speak. With Unohana's pledge to assist him in training Naruto, he might at last have an opportunity to truly make a difference, but at least now he had hope. Now that his shurikai was out, he may, at least, depending on how much trouble he was going to get into. In theory, unless they shared their shurikai with someone else, no Shinigami could be punished for the nature of their shurikai. No matter how risky it might be, you could not be held accountable or prohibited from utilizing it because it was beyond their control. But concealing the fact that he was aware of Zanpakuto's name might be a crime. All Shinigami had to tell someone about what it did, even if he never did, or it might be interpreted as an attempt to conceal something from the Central 46. If anyone knew one thing, even if they were too scared to say it out, it was that Central 46 was full of neurotic old men and women who were more focused on maintaining their own authority than the purpose for which they were formed. Naruto was only somewhat shocked to see that the captains of the 2nd and 12th Divisions were waiting for them in addition to the captain commander when they arrived at the conference hall. Suifeng was giving him a calculating look, her gaze shifting from his face to the sword at his hip, and he didn't like the looks any of them was giving him. In contrast, Mayuri simply had Kurama's eyes, a sneer on his face, and a ravenous expression. Before they could even bow, the lone commander remarked as they came to a stop in front of Yamamoto, and Unohana moved to take her position as the captain of the 4th Division. Ikaku Madarame and Yumachika Ayasegawa, your presence is not required for the remainder of this meeting, you are dismissed. Both Shinigami walked away without saying anything, but Naruto did see the glance they exchanged as they went by. The doors closed behind them. Naruto dropped to one knee, placed one hand on his Zanpakuto's hilt, and bowed his head before the captain commander. He remained with his head down, waiting to be addressed, and for a brief period, nothing was spoken, but he could feel all of their eyes on him. Naruto, I must admit I am impressed. How long have you been hiding? When did you first learn your Zanpakuto's name? My 2nd year at the academy, sir. That long, impressive, though I wonder if you would have been able to hide for as long as you have, without Captain Unohana's help. At this point, Naruto looked up, but he kept his head down. He gasped at the old man's ferocious expression as he gazed down at him. Captain Unohana has been good to me. Indeed she has. It is also because of her recommendation, and the fact you informed her about having attained shurikai, that you will not be punished for your actions. Unable to think of anything to say, Naruto's head snapped up to look at the captain commander, his eyes widening. Yamamoto's terrified and wrinkled face crinkled as he smiled slightly at his response. She requested I send a member of the 2nd Division to observe your first mission, promising I would see something interesting, and from the report I have been given she was right. You have a lot of potential, San, and from this point on we will be cultivating it. I don't understand. Captain Mayuri will be providing you with Jigai for training until you are able to control your Zanpakuto. He has already ordered them moved to Captain Unohana's training ground. When you have gained enough control that you are no longer a risk to others in the field, Captain Suifeng has shown an interest in assisting in your training, and possibly recruiting you to the 2nd Division. Until that time, however, you will remain in the 4th as Captain Unohana's vice-captain. Naruto was still at a loss for words, and all he could do was stare around the room, his mouth hanging open and his eyes wide with bewilderment. I still don't understand. You have skill, San, along with the power to back it up, and a Zanpakuto that could become one of the most feared in the history of the Godai 13. A Zanpakuto that nothing can escape from, that can track the blood of any that touch its metal, is a useful skill to have at our disposal. I understand your wish to remain in the 4th Division, but you have more use to us in the field than on cleaning detail. Knowing that something like this would occur, Naruto sighed and nodded his head slightly. I understand, sir. Good, then we have nothing more to discuss. You are dismissed. Naruto stood silently and bowed to each captain before Shumpoing left the room. XXX. I don't know why you will not just let me examine the Zanpakuto. It could hold interesting data for research purposes. If you just give me permission, I could take it from him. The man recoiled slightly from Unohana as she turned her charming face toward him and scowled at the insane scientist, letting her ki show. You will do no such thing. If I find out you have made any move against him, I will personally make sure you regret it. Mayuri was prevented from defending himself by the sound of the captain commander's cane striking the ground. Suifome, who had been silently observing them, turned to face him as well. Enough, both of you, remember your ranks. As the elderly Shinigami approached them, they both nodded slightly in agreement with his remarks, but they kept glaring at one another out of the corners of their eyes. Nothing will be done to Naruto. He will be trained to control his Zanpakuto, and to reach his full potential. And once he is ready, San will make a good captain. The people in the room, as well as a few others who weren't there, were aware of this, and Unohana could only grin at the idea, feeling proud of herself. She had known from the beginning that Yamamoto needed to be informed of Naruto's health, even though it had been a betrayal of his trust. Like her own bloodlust, and like Kenpachi's now, his bloodlust might be both beneficial and detrimental to Soul Society. After she told him, they began planning together. Naruto had all the qualities of a good captain, and they were going to make sure he was prepared so he could take over when a new captain was needed. With a grimace on her face, Suifome stepped forward and folded her arms across her chest. Are you sure about this, Captain Yamamoto? His is still only 10 years out of the academy. Normally it takes hundreds before even making vice captain. Yamamoto sighed deeply and nodded his head slowly before turning to the solemn captain of the 2nd Division. I know this is happening fast, but I truly believe we will see great things from him. Even before learning the true nature of his Zanpakuto, San showed potential, but now I think I was not giving him enough credit. San is a hunter, one that we will train and mold, before pointing him towards his prey. He will be ready for whatever lays ahead of him, and will become a true protector of Soul Society, one that we will all be proud to call a comrade. The lone man left the room without saying anything more. Unohana watched his disappearing body for a brief minute before walking away. XXX. I hope the chapter was enjoyable to you. And now for the synopsis. Naruto's shuriken is essentially composed of tiny black scythes on the tips of his fingers, thousands of crimson needles that cover his arms and back, and a tail that resembles fur. After leaving his body, the needles will follow whoever's blood comes into contact with their metal, even if it is sealed. When tied to him, Naruto can engage in hand-to-hand combat until he obtains his target's blood, utilizing his tail to augment his fighting abilities. After leaving his body, they create a swarm that resembles the petals of Byakuya's Senbon Sakura and follows the target until it is killed. This movement is known as the hunt. Ignoring everything else, they will pursue their targets sequentially, beginning with the oldest sample and working their way up to the newest. The hunt ability is what makes Naruto's Zanpakuto so lethal. Naruto will be able to stop a hunt with training, but Kurama will always be able to resume it without using any more blood. Additionally, given training, he will be able to utilize it without killing the target.